Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today is Student Young Pugwash UK's first event of our Festival of Ethical Science. My name is Niamh Healy, and I am the current Student Young Pugwash president. We have two great speakers that will be joining us today to discuss ethics in digital technology. The festival was originally intended to be a conference, however, because of the current circumstances, we moved it to a digital event, and we're rebranding it as a festival, hopefully to make it a little bit more fun for everyone, rather than whole days of Zooms. I'm really excited about this event. I think it will be a really great start to the festival, and I hope you all enjoy it. I'll begin by introducing our two speakers, and then they will speak each on different topics, and we can move to a question and answers section at the end. You could submit questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window, or via the chat. I'll keep an eye out on both. And you can either type your question, or there is an option for you to be able to speak. So our first speaker today will be Julia Skoopska, who is a doctoral student at the Centre for Doctoral Training in Cybersecurity and the Oxford Internet Institute. Her research focuses on how cybersecurity concepts and practices can address technologically mediated abuse, like image-based sexual abuse, revenge porn, and stalking. She is also exploring how feminist theories and methods, such as participatory action research and the ethics of care, can improve cybersecurity. So thank you, Julia, for joining us today. Our second speaker will be Dr. Kanta Dihal, who is a senior research fellow at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. She is the principal investigator on the Global AI Narratives Project, which explores intercultural public understanding of artificial intelligence as constructed by fictional and non-fictional narratives. She obtained her DPhil in science communication at the University of Oxford in 2018. Kanta's work intersects the fields of science communication, literature and science fiction. She is co-editor of AI Narratives, a history of imaginative thinking about intelligence machines, 2020, and is currently turning her DPhil thesis into a monograph. So thank you, Dr. Dihal, for joining us as well. And Julia, if you want to get started, that would be wonderful.
Thanks, Niamh, and thank you so much, Pugwash, for having me. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. Obviously, it is a very stressful time for lots of people, myself included, so it's great to see people coming. And hopefully this talk will be a way for all of us to get away from the polls for an hour or so. So as Niamh mentioned, I'm looking at what different feminist theories and methods can offer the field of cybersecurity. And I thought, given Pugwash's kind of history and international relations and nuclear disarmament, I'd start by talking about feminist international relations theory. And which is, I think, similarly to feminist cybersecurity, kind of an unintuitive concept, right? Like, what does feminist theory have to say about international politics? And the answer to that is that a lot of feminist theorists kind of questioned what counts as international relations or what counts as international security in the first place. Often when we think of international politics, we think of quote unquote high politics. So war rooms where generals make decisions about invasions, or UN negotiations, often rooms full of kind of men in suits making serious decisions. And one kind of early critique of this in the 70s came from, came from a theorist called Cynthia Enloe, who argued that international politics also happens sort of at a banana plantation in Barbados, or a sex worker camp outside of a US military base in South Korea. These are places where power is negotiated, where sort of international politics also happens. And if theorists studying security or theorists studying international politics only look at the places where quote unquote high politics happens, they're recreating dynamics of exclusion where these people's lives are said not to matter. And she also asked she asked future feminist theorists to look closely at who makes decisions and what kind of assumptions and omissions they make. So that's kind of one set of questions that I'll be focusing on today. And another theorist that might be relevant to people in the room is Carol Kahn, who looked at nuclear defense policy in the 80s. Specifically, she looked very closely at the sort of language and metaphors used to describe nuclear missiles, arguing that they were often quite emotional or visceral and sometimes even sexual, which kind of stood in contrast to the supposedly highly rational field of nuclear defense policy. And she compared that to the way that these theorists spoke about sort of human lives or human suffering, arguing it was often dismissed as sort of using like really impersonal language, like collateral damage. And through that, she made the argument that often when these security theorists talked about security, they were talking about the security of the technology or the missiles themselves, rather than the security or safety of potentially thousands of people which could be harmed. And that too, I think, is a really valuable observation for looking at cybersecurity. So in my work, I argue that these sort of patterns, which were critiqued by feminist theorists of security in the 70s and 80s, are now being recreated in the emerging field of cybersecurity. One way that I've tried to, one way where I think this is quite evident is in a method called threat modeling. So I don't know, I'm not sure whether anyone in this room is in cybersecurity, but threat modeling is a fairly common technique which cybersecurity practitioners and researchers use. And it's a systematic way to think through in any kind of given technical system what the main assets are, so what's valuable, what the potential threats are, and how a system can be compromised, and what probable likely mitigations are. So for example, if you're worried about DDoS or distributed denial of service attacks, you look at the ways in which they can take down your website, and you might install mitigations. So for example, something that detects abnormal traffic and automatically routes it away from your website. And this method has been applied, for example, to devices like smart home devices, so smart locks or smart thermometers, things that use Bluetooth or Wi-Fi to connect to the internet. And I did a study looking at the threat models which came up in security analyses of smart home devices, and noticed a clear pattern where all of the threats in the threat models were people external to the house. So something called a network-based adversary, which is basically a hacker or a thief, or even domestic workers or Airbnb guests. These kind of threats were all considered by the security analyses of smart locks, but it was almost never someone in the home, even though, as kind of feminist theorists have argued for decades, domestic violence or intimate partner violence is a really common source of security threat for many people throughout the world. And this unfortunately hasn't changed. So a recent UN study found that women were more likely to be killed in the home than anywhere else throughout the world. So this can be recreated in patterns of tech abuse or technology abuse, things like stalking, harassment, image-based abuse, which is commonly called revenge porn, although that is not an appropriate word for it because A, it implies that it's pornography, which it isn't, and B, it implies a revenge motive. So it implies that the victim did something to deserve it, which is why I use the term image-based abuse. And unfortunately, this whole set of threats, so threats by someone within the intimate sphere, which use technology, are systematically excluded from cybersecurity research. So they're often considered to be not real security threats, particularly in the mainstream, although there definitely is a lot of really great emerging research on intimate partner violence and tech abuse in cybersecurity. But coming back to the idea of a smart home, coming back to the idea of a threat model, that assumption that someone within the home is not going to be a threat, and that in fact all of the threats are kind of outside of the home, and so you need to protect the smart home from external compromise, is a problematic assumption in this case. And it reflects kind of blind spots or omissions by whoever is designing the security for the device. And it also reflects that kind of old feminist critique of the personal is political, there's the home is not necessarily a safe space for everyone, and it's a place with many different politics. And that isn't necessarily just kind of gender politics or abuse within intimate partnerships. That can be kind of landlords versus tenants. It can be, the home is also a workspace. So many kind of nannies or domestic workers are subject to surveillance within the home. And it can also be things within the family. So in all of those cases, a smart home device, particularly one which say records video or records data about when people enter and exit the home, can become a surveillance device from the owner of the technology. And so if security and cybersecurity is solely focused on not compromising the security of the device, if it's only thinking about protecting the technology and not thinking about the broader social dynamics of how people use the technology, it's potentially recreating those kind of power dynamics. So what I'm arguing for is thinking more broadly, not just in terms of security of the device and by extension its owner, but towards something called abusability, which would mean that designers, before they put a product out in the market, think in the same way that they're meant to think systematically about security, they also think systematically about limiting the potential for a device or system or a network to be abused before they put it out on the market. And actually, an interesting example of this is the technology we're using right now, which is Zoom. So Zoom, especially early on in the pandemic, was heavily criticized for having insufficient security features. There was a lot of kind of debate about whether its encryption was adequate for the exploded use. But one form of security threat, sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear it, but there's a siren, so I'm gonna wait till it passes. So one form of security threat which wasn't anticipated in those debates was Zoom bombing. And this was a form of attack where people would display sort of pornographic or often racist or anti-Semitic images, which technically speaking was using the features of this program exactly as it was intended, right? It was using the screen sharing feature. It wasn't exploiting a kind of vulnerability in the code. It wasn't breaking anything, but it was using the features in a way that was harmful to others. And that's exactly the kind of abuse that I think security, like holistic and feminist security, should be thinking of going forward. This kind of a security would also pay close attention to intersectional aspects of abuse. So there was a report recently from an organization called Glitch, which I think is really interesting, looking at an increase in abuse specifically during the pandemic and demonstrating that women experience it disproportionately, but particularly women of color experience online harassment and abuse disproportionately. And these kind of vulnerabilities can be traced in many different forms of online abuse. So for example, I spoke earlier about domestic workers being particularly vulnerable to surveillance because they work in other people's homes and some of the laws on banning covert surveillance don't apply. Those kind of workers are disproportionately women of color and disproportionately migrants, who are also generally more vulnerable to things like domestic violence because they often are more worried about going to the police or reporting to the police. And so if cybersecurity moved more broadly towards thinking about abusability, it would need to take these things into consideration. And also keep in mind that all of these forms of abuse are closely linked to device design. So particularly features like remote tracking, covert tracking, sharing data, especially sharing data in ways that aren't transparent to the user. But at the same time, they aren't necessarily going to be solved by technology design. So I'm not saying that like building kind of better apps or better security is going to permanently solve these forms of abuse, but technology design, so inadequate technology design can offer more opportunities for it. So it's something that security theorists and security researchers need to be looking closely at and kind of continually asking those questions. Who owns the technology? Are we protecting just the technology or the people using it? And if so, which people and who's the most vulnerable? And also on a kind of maybe more meta level, how does the way that we're researching security recreate existing patterns of control, kind of continually having that reflexive process of rather than a kind of more narrow approach on just securing a device. So before I hand over, I think Niamh asked me to speak a little bit about a project that I've been doing more recently, looking at how different feminist methods can offer positive values for cybersecurity rather than just kind of this critique, which, I mean, I guess that's probably not a correct division. But so I've been running a series of action research workshops looking at digital privacy, where we invited people to come to these community spaces and reflect on their own digital privacy. So what makes them feel threatened online, what they'd like to improve on, and offered kind of some amount of tech support and tried to be as non-hierarchical as possible. So taking sort of a tradition of feminist focus on things like care or things like emotionality, we were trying to resist this tendency in cybersecurity to be quite mocking or condescending to users. You'll often hear in cybersecurity that users don't care enough or that they're lazy. And I don't think that's true. I think lots of people care really deeply about being safe online. I think it can be hard to engage with cybersecurity because of kind of obscure technical language that's often thrown around when talking about it, and also because of a general feeling of being overwhelmed or avoiding, and therefore avoiding the subject kind of for all those reasons. But even though people don't necessarily care about the aspects of cybersecurity experts may tell them that they should care about, they do really care about being safe online and keeping others in their life safe online. And I think one anecdote can illustrate this. So when we first came, when people first came to our workshops, we started off with this discussion asking what makes you feel threatened online, which was recreating in a way the method of threat modeling that I talked about earlier, just trying to think about assets. But rather than asking people kind of what the most important cybersecurity assets are, we tried to ask these questions in a way where everyone's answers would be valid. And one person that came to these workshops responded online banking, which was in a way a kind of unintuitive response, because many people, when we asked the question that way, had said that their own personal data, things like intimate images, were in a way more important to them, because even though online banking was important, it's maybe already protected by, like, they trust that their bank is protecting them, or at least will reimburse them if something goes wrong. But then this person followed this up saying that because they were a trans person in a country where it is not yet legal to be out as trans, online banking made them feel threatened because as a default, it would use their legal name rather than their chosen name, which I think is exactly the kind of threat which existing threat models of cybersecurity, which tend to come from like a fairly narrow group of people who don't have these kind of experiences. I think existing threat models would totally miss how someone might feel threatened by online banking in this way. And so I think it would be amazing to see in going forward cybersecurity that's more grounded in kind of concerns like this, cybersecurity that tries to build supportive spaces and community spaces, because your security depends on what others do and vice versa. And a lot of these things like privacy and security, which we often think of as very individual, in reality are like, I think can be much more productive and can be much more workable if thought of at the community level. So I think now I'll hand it over to, I don't know, Niamh or Kanta, but I look forward to your questions, and feel free to contact me if you have more questions.
And that was great. Thank you, Julia, for that great speech and introduction to feminist cybersecurity. Kanta, if you'd like to begin, and any of the participants, feel free to put questions in either the chat or the Q&A that are both at the bottom.
Thank you, Niamh. Okay, so let me just share my slideshow because I have pictures, which is necessary for the kind of work I'm going to cover. So as Niamh mentioned, I'm a senior research fellow at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge, where I lead the Global AI Narratives and Decolonising AI projects. And the work I'll present today is all joined with my colleague, Dr. Stephen Cave. So over the summer, we had a paper published on the whiteness of AI in the journal Philosophy and Technology, and to our amazement, that received a huge amount of press coverage, which is, I'm guessing, why I'm here today. So in that work, we explore the truth little acknowledged that a machine in possession of intelligence must be white. Typing terms like robot or artificial intelligence into a search engine will give you a load of stock images of white plastic humanoids. And not only are those machines white in color, but the more human they're made to look, the more their features are made ethnically white. And we offer three possible explanations for this. And those explanations regard different ways in which their whiteness reflects and embeds privilege and prejudice. So our concern is with the racialization as white of both real and imagined machines that are implied or claimed to be intelligent. And by racialization, we mean ascribing characteristics that are used to identify and delineate races. And creators of humanoid machines, whether they are real robots like Asimo or Pepper, or imagined ones like the Terminator, can explicitly or implicitly, consciously or unconsciously, racialize their creations. So to assess evidence for the racialization as white of representations of AI, we looked across four categories: robots, virtual assistants, stock images, and film and television. So first of all, the whiteness of humanoid robots. And various scholars, not just us, have remarked on how omnipresent the whiteness of humanoid robots is. So I'm showing some well-known examples here, including some which are just white in color, but less obviously white in ethnicity, all the way through to the much publicized Sophia from Hanson Robotics, which is very clearly white in both senses. Then chatbots and virtual assistants. So although these don't exhibit visual racial cues, they're racialized by means of socio-linguistic markers. That means things like their vocabulary and their accent. And while there are versions of well-known virtual assistants that are labeled as Indian English, etc., options that are framed as British English or US English are invariably cued, so with their vocabulary and accent, as white and middle class. Then stock images of AI. And this was really the one that set us off on this on the path of this research, because we just kept noticing that stock images of AI, when it's anthropomorphized, is overwhelmingly white in color and ethnicity. So they are what search engines like Google offer up if you look for images of AI or intelligent robots. Because such images are already so prevalent, and then of course they become more common because they are what Google offers. And in film and television, Well, in science fiction from the 19th century onwards, AI is nearly always imagined as white. So, for instance, icons such as the Terminator, Robocop, the replicants in Blade Runner, Ava in Ex Machina, they're all played by white actors and they are visibly white on screen. So why are intelligent robots portrayed as white? Well, what Stephen and I offer is three interpretations. First is the normalization of whiteness in the West. Secondly, the whiteness of the attributes and characteristics ascribed to AI. And thirdly, the extent to which AI permits the erasure of people of color from a white utopia. So to start with the normalization of whiteness in European and North American societies. Now, of course, in these cultures, whiteness is so normal, prevalent, common that many people don't notice that these human-like machines are racialized, but merely see them as conforming to their idea of what human-like means, of what a human looks like. And that racialization, it really only becomes visible when people then see something like this, which is an image of a robot racialized as black, a still from the film Robots of Brixton. So given the normalization of whiteness, of course, that might be one reason why we might expect this proliferation of white humanoid robots as simply a default that people don't think about. So the theorist Richard Dyer has put this very eloquently: white people create the dominant images of the world and don't quite see that they thus create the dominant images of the world in their own image. Sure, but that's not a satisfactory explanation in its own right, because not all intelligent humanoid entities imagined by predominantly white industries are portrayed as white. For example, Western science fiction has a very long tradition of racializing extraterrestrials as non-white. From the 19th century onwards, science fiction has very frequently racialized alien invaders as East Asian. And more recently, in the 90s, the Star Wars prequel trilogy was criticized for the transparent racism, as one critic put it, in, on the one hand, its depiction of the alien Jar Jar Binks as a West Indian caricature, and on the other hand, the slave trader Watto as an anti-Semitic Jewish caricature with a large nose, a skull cap, a Yiddish accent, and an obsession with money. So that racialization of aliens in science fiction suggests that the racialization of artificial intelligence as white is not simply an unthinking, not very well thought through, but also a choice, which therefore requires further explanation. So that's why we have our second explanation. We argue that AI is mainly racialized as white because it's considered to possess attributes that are normally attributed to white people by white people. Those three attributes are intelligence, professionalism, and power. So first, intelligence. The European colonial project legitimized itself by the idea that some races were more mentally able than others. And those considered less intelligent were considered unqualified to rule themselves and their lands. And so it was considered legitimate, or even a duty, the white man's burden, Kipling put it, to destroy their cultures and take their territories. And throughout the 19th century, many efforts were made to empirically demonstrate, to measure that intellectual difference, culminating in the development of the IQ test. And although explicit associations between racial groups and intelligence declined after the Second World War, they continue to be made in right-wing circles, and implicit or unconscious associations between race and intelligence persist much more widely. So, given that centuries-long association of intelligence with the white European race, it's to be expected that when this culture is asked to imagine an intelligent machine, it imagines a white machine. Secondly, much of the current discourse around AI focuses on how it is or will soon be capable of professional work. So in this sense, AI is often contrasted with previous waves of automation in which machines took over manual or semi-skilled labor. And of course, the professions, so law and medicine and business and so on, are associated with whiteness because they have such long histories of excluding people of color, for instance, by not allowing them into universities. And thirdly, alongside the narrative that robots will make humans redundant, an equally well-known narrative is that they will rise up and conquer us altogether. Those are narratives about machines becoming superior to humans. So stories in which machines become better at every task, or in which they outwit and subjugate those who built them. Now, when white people imagine being overtaken by superior beings, they would not imagine them resembling peoples whom they have long framed as inferior. And instead they imagine them as superlatives of themselves. So hyper-masculine white men like Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator, or hyper-feminine white women like Alicia Vikander as Ava in Ex Machina. And so that's why even narratives of an AI uprising that are clearly modeled on stories of slave rebellions depict the rebellious AI as white, for example, in Blade Runner. And then finally, the whiteness of these machines, we argue, allows the white utopian imagination to exclude people of color. And one of the most pertinent hopes for artificial intelligence is that it will lead to a life of ease. It relieves its owners of unwanted work, enabling them to pursue leisure. And critical race theorists have pointed out that the leisure available to the wealthier classes is disproportionately facilitated by the labor of working class women of color. Yet even this relationship seems undesirable to those in power. Bell Hooks, for example, writes, "Blacks, I realized, were simply invisible to most white people, except as a pair of hands offering a drink on a silver tray." So there's a pretense of invisibility that shows how undesirable interactions with non-white servants are considered to be by their white masters. This work is considered a dirty job, and therefore the people themselves dirty by implication. And as science fiction scholars throughout the 20th and 21st century have shown, utopias throughout literary history have been constructed on premises of exclusion, colonialism, and eugenics. So the utopia framed by the white racial frame removes people of color altogether, even in the form of servants, replacing them with machines that have all these characteristics of being white. Because AI is imagined as able to replace any and all unwanted labor, social as well as physical, it makes the need for people of color in those inferior roles no longer necessary. And so the critic Jennifer Rhee has pointed out that advertisements for real AI, such as household robots, all aim at showing white middle-class families an ideal leisurely lifestyle, while erasing the women of color who performed this labor within their own homes and in the homes of others before these robots arrived. So, what are the consequences of this racialization? Well, first of all, bias in representations of AI contributes to a vicious cycle of social injustice. The biased representations can influence both aspiring technologists and those in charge of hiring new staff, so shaping together whom they consider fit for the field. And all of that contributes to sustaining a racially homogeneous workforce, which will continue to produce products that are biased to benefit that group and disadvantage others. Secondly, portrayals of AI as white place these machines in a power hierarchy above currently marginalized groups. Now, with automation bias, which is the tendency of people to favor suggestions from automated decision-making systems over those from humans, might be exacerbated in cases where such systems are racialized as white and the humans in question are not. And thirdly, these portrayals could distort our perceptions of the risks and benefits of these machines. So we mentioned that it's a common narrative that the current wave of automation will impact white-collar work this time. And so therefore, public interest and public policy very often focus on the impact of automation on white-collar professionals. But research shows that negative impacts of AI are in reality more likely to impact marginalized groups. Now, this work has opened up this conversation, but a lot more research is needed. And that is part of what is needed to decolonize AI, which is to break down the systems of oppression that arose with colonialism and have led to present injustices, which AI threatens to perpetuate and to make worse. The term decolonizing is sometimes misused, but it refers to a process of constantly unsettling, upsetting, and questioning the colonial legacies that support the status quo. And that could mean enabling people to make the informed decision not to use certain technologies, or enabling them to develop their own tools, or showing to people who create the technologies what they are doing wrong and who they are excluding. And so we hope with this paper to have contributed in a small way to this decolonizing process. But it is a much smaller part of the Decolonizing AI project that I am currently running. And in this case, we have done so by drawing attention to the whiteness of these machines and making that strange. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kanta. That was really interesting, and I think a really good overview of the paper for any of the participants who haven't taken a look at that. I would encourage attendees to add some questions if you have any from the panelists in either the Q&A box or the chat. I think I'd like to ask some questions myself, if that's okay, as taking advantage of my position as chair. Julia, I was really interested after hearing kind of Kanta's presentation. I was thinking a lot about digital assistants and the way these assistants are often gendered. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what some of the feminist critiques of digital assistants, kind of like Alexa, have been. And Kanta, I was wondering, for any students here who are in some capacity either learning or researching AI, do you have any kind of proposals for them as to what they can do if this is kind of the introduction to the issue as to how to become more aware of it and to build these kind of decolonial and anti-racist perspectives into their own work if they are kind of coming at this from a more kind of novice perspective, or it's the first time they've thought about their own work in this way?
Yeah, so I guess I'll answer my question first. So I think there has been a good bit of research at this point done on how digital voice assistants can are another example of how gendered assumptions can be encoded into AI, sort of laying out how the default for the Google AI assistant or Alexa or Siri, they're always kind of like polite and helpful, somewhat subservient female voices. I think there was a study as well where they kind of systematically tested how these voices would react to sexual harassment. And they often like brushed it off or acted like it was a compliment, which was very strange. I think yeah, I'm curious like how that comes about in terms of the language models. And I think as a result of that research, which was also republished in a UN report, some of these companies tried to make them more feminist. And I think there's been, I can't think of the theorist off the top of my mind, but there's been a general observation that in cultural representations of AI, the general trend is when the AI is all powerful and evil and meant to take over the world, it's presented as male, while things that are kind of personal assistance or subservient, like in her, they're coded as female. Although, as Kanta pointed out, that's not exhaustive, and I think kind of hyper feminine white AI that are taking over, like the one in Ex Machina, show that sort of that intersection of whiteness and femininity can be imagined as like all powerful in popular culture, even though at the moment the way that it's coded in like voice assistants, it tends to be like female voices as subservient, kind of obedient helpers.
That was great. Thank you, Julia.
Well, and regarding what current students can do, I think the first place to start is with reading and understanding the context in which you are creating these technologies. Because unfortunately, ethics and just the whole public context, the cultural context in which these technologies that computer scientists are going to release their work aren't usually included in computer science curricula yet, which is extremely unfortunate because it suggests that you're creating these technologies in some sort of a vacuum, whereas I think it's really important to understand the power of what you are creating, the impact that can have on society. I guess it also just would make your work a lot more exciting to know what it could potentially do. So reading more into more of the research into social and ethical implications of various technologies that you're interested in, that you are developing. A lot of this work is in the form of case studies, specifically pointing out what has gone wrong in the past. So this is things like the work of Cathy O'Neill, Weapons of Mass Destruction, which is a great book that just lists a whole load of case studies of how different mathematical applications, computer science applications, have impacted society at large. And I think that would give you a much better understanding of where your own work could potentially go.
That's great, and that's a great recommendation for anyone listening. Hopefully this festival as well will be as a starting point for some people in engaging in these kind of questions around the responsibilities of their own work. I have two more questions, if that's okay, and then we will go to audience questions. Julia, I was thinking when you were speaking about, I think what the area of kind of international diplomacy around cybersecurity that gets most at the attention in kind of academic literature and in news stories and in kind of policy research as well is, and I know you've written about this, is often focusing on kind of metaphors of cyber war. And it takes a very kind of militaristic approach to cybersecurity and prioritizes certain ways of thinking about cybersecurity internationally. And I know partly this is affected by how institutionally cybersecurity is dealt with internationally, being within the UNGA's first committee, primarily the main body. For kind of students of international relations who are here, how do you think kind of feminist cybersecurity can help kind of international policymakers or people who are thinking about this in terms of international governance to kind of reframe this issue and think about cybersecurity less in kind of that more militaristic way? And then for Kanta, this is quite a specific question, but I was thinking about Black Panther when you were speaking as kind of something that a film and kind of a broader media environment that has quite a different portrayal and perspective on kind of advanced technologies. And there is an AI in the film that's voiced by Trevor Noah. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that film and kind of what the imaginations kind of shown in that kind of contribute to this wider discussion.
Thank you for that question. So am I muted? Because I just got a message about being muted. Can you hear me? Okay. All right. Yeah, so I think there's a really interesting history in critical and feminist thought in paying attention to metaphors, and particularly metaphors that are used to describe technology. So a lot of things that happen within the realm of information security are quite abstract. And so it's natural to turn to metaphors to explain what's going on. So I think I mentioned during my talk, DDoS attacks or distributed denial of service attacks, which even that word attack, it kind of implies something kind of militaristic. But in what a sort of textbook explanation of a DDoS attack is that it's a set of kind of requests to a website which floods or overloads it. And that can be metaphorically understood as like a group of people crowding an entrance to a shop, as in like a protest rather than an attack, not something that necessarily destroys or like invades, because DDoS attacks generally don't destroy any data, they just block access to it for some time. And if you take that as like one tiny example, like you mentioned on the mass scale, we often think of cybersecurity as this like shadow war fought underneath the surface by hackers and militaries, in a kind of really adversarial model, which also implies a set of assumptions for what states should be doing. So states should be kind of defending their own citizens and then proactively maybe trying to hack into other state systems to defend against future attacks. But on a kind of global level, you could use very different metaphors to understand what cybersecurity policy is about. So thinking about it more in terms of health or in terms of protecting a global environment or building a stable global infrastructure, it points more attention to the different ways in which cybersecurity strategies which create more security in one area. So for example, releasing patches for Windows or shutting down bots. That kind of action in one area creates more security everywhere. And there's a lot more connections that are kind of shared by everyone rather than set up in this adversarial model. And so I think the kind of paying close attention to those underlying conceptual metaphors can point people towards very different policy directions.
Thank you.
I would be so surprised if "you're on mute" is not going to be the phrase of the year of Merriam-Webster. Black Panther, yay! I really love that film, and I was absolutely devastated to hear about Chadwick Boseman dying at age 42 or something. But I think with regard to Black Panther's engagement with technology, to some extent, it does perpetuate some ideas, some perceptions of who technology belongs to and who can and who should engage with technology. And we must bear in mind, thinking of that originally Black Panther was invented by two white American men. Because the idea that there is this nation hidden in the depths of Africa that becomes extremely scientifically advanced is very exciting until you think, oh, hang on, this is because this meteorite crashes into the Earth. And do we really need a sort of apocalypse level alien intervention in order to be able to get a technologically advanced African country? And then the other idea, which I thought that the film engaged with really quite cleverly, was the I forgot his name, but the baddie of the film, because what I like is that we don't just have the stereotypical bad guy, but this is a baddie who has a mission that I can somewhat get behind. The idea of, well, we should spread the technological advances of Wakanda to the rest of the African continent, which then is portrayed as being a problem because Wakanda very much wants to, not let the technology go out where it might be misused. But again, there's this idea of, here is a great technology, and technology should improve the African continent, which again is really awkwardly similar to the approach that many, especially US-based tech companies, are taking to improving various African countries, or Africa as a whole, through pushing various kinds of their own technology. So in that sense, Black Panther raises and makes visible some of these issues, but doesn't necessarily offer a good way out of them. Then perhaps there is no easy way out of them, and it will require and even an alien meteorite metal will not easily solve these issues.
That was a really interesting answer. Thank you. I now want to go and rewatch that film with that critique in mind, and yeah, maybe that's how I'll spend my evening rather than refreshing a live feed about the election. Maybe kind of to wrap this up, kind of bringing in one of the questions from the Q&A box, and kind of a question for both of you is maybe about kind of private companies. And so you have these big large technology firms that are really kind of setting the agenda and really shaping the development and emergence of new digital technologies. Kind of what role do you see these companies having in addressing the issues that you both described? And do you think the initiative should lay with them? Is it kind of a partnership between them and kind of other governance actors? It would be great to hear kind of your perspective on the role the private sector can and might play in this.
I don't know if
do you want to go first, Niamh?
Yeah, well, I think so. This is a difficult question. I think it's one where I don't think I'm fully settled in what my thinking is. So I think I'll try to explain what my thinking is at this moment, with the disclaimer that I could very much see it changing. Which is, so one thing I specifically would like, one kind of specific change that I would like to see private actors in this space implement is what I've called, and others, it's not a term that I've coined, but what I've called abusability, which is in the product development process. Anytime you want to roll out a new feature, a new device, you think much more carefully about how it can be abused. And I think that process should often lead not just to tweaking or modifying a platform, say, so that it's harder to do stalking or harder to do image-based abuse, but also sometimes not rolling out features, like doing a careful reflexive evaluation, being like, is this feature likely to create harm and suffering and abuse in the world, and therefore should it not be rolled out? And I think if that process was implemented seriously across the industry, then I think a lot of the existing kind of threats or existing kind of forms of abuse that are happening in these platforms that perpetuate racism or sexism or threaten democracy, like maybe could be anticipated and mitigated. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of powerful critiques from people. So for example, Shoshana Zuboff argues that trying to advocate for these companies mitigating privacy concerns is taking away their fundamental business model, which I think if you translate it to the area that I'm looking at with coercive control and domestic abuse, a lot of these forms of abuse are possible because of how much intimate granular data these platforms kind of prompt from us and how easily available they make it to everyone else, which is to some extent their business model. So asking them to make that harder may be like too much of an ask. And I think anyone who's in the tech ethics space, anyone who's in the critical tech ethics space, has to constantly contend with the risk that their work will be co-opted in a way that justifies these technologies or kind of whitewashes them or pinkwashes them. And that's a difficult thing to contend with. So yeah, I'd be curious to hear what you think, Kanta.
Yes, well, that was a very eloquent answer, and I'm afraid my thoughts on this are not as well informed. I simply think that tech companies have become so large that it is going to be very hard to get any fundamental change happening without them being involved and even leading on this. But we have seen also a lot has changed over the past decade or so. laws and regulations have been slow to catch up, but they have been catching up. And I mean, just to oh, this was going to be a distraction from the US elections, wasn't it? Because the example I was going to bring in is how Twitter now flags misinformation, and whether a certain account is a spokesperson for a government, etc. And so many of those things that have been addressed, especially publicly addressed as harmful, have been at least worked on. So I think I am hopeful in that sense, and also seeing that well, there has been, especially in the UK and in Europe, pretty much a mass exodus from Facebook around the Cambridge Analytica time. It gives me hope that the combination of political and just general popular power will bring in change.
Thank you. So thank you again to Kanta and Julia for serving as our panelists for today. And thank you as well to all our participants for joining on this quite gloomy Wednesday in many ways. I hope everyone has a nice afternoon, evening, or day. And please do come along for the remaining of the events that we have in the Festival of Ethical Science. There is more information about this on the British Pugwash website. Yeah, so thank you, and enjoy your evenings.